A quiet courtyard, a tranquil sea, windmills turning softly in the cool northern breeze. The art of 17th century Holland speaks of nature, of order, of a society at peace with itself and its surroundings. That such images could arise from a country ravaged by centuries of brutal warfare is one of the great ironies in the history of art. In 1522, Emperor Charles V orders the Spanish Inquisition into the Dutch lowlands. After 45 years of systematic repression, the Calvinists rise in violent protest, storming the churches and smashing the Catholic icons. King Philip II, furious, installs a military governor, the Duke of Alba. In the summer of 1567, Alba convenes the Council of Blood, and a reign of terror begins. Thousands are executed without trial in an effort to stem Protestant and nationalist fervor. When Counts Egmont and Van Horn protest the persecution to King Philip himself, they too are arrested, pronounced guilty of high treason, and beheaded. Suddenly, the sporadic resistance becomes an open revolt. William I, Prince of Orange and Count of Nassau, leads the rebellion. Though known as William the Silent for his caution at the prospect of war, the prince is an eloquent and charismatic leader. But Alba is a field general of far greater experience, and William is easily defeated. The Dutch citizens, however, continue to resist. They flood their own fields and burn their own homes to avoid losing them to Spanish invaders. William's greatest allies are the so-called sea beggars of the English Channel. Though their loyalties are often suspect, these pirates and privateers score numerous successes against the Spanish fleet. They gain tentative control of the land, but lack effective leadership. William I converts to Calvinism and leads the rebels to victory. The Union of Utrecht is signed on the 23rd day of January, 1579, marking the birth of the Dutch Republic. 4 years later, William the Silent, Prince of Orange, agrees to become the sovereign ruler of the Netherlands. He is assassinated the following year by an emissary of King Philip II of Spain. The Dutch Republic of the early 17th century was a nation still struggling to define itself. Besieged by threats both foreign and domestic, the people of Holland found solace in their churches, their families, their work, and their art. In the absence of Catholic patronage, local artists turned instead to the open market, painting to suit the moral and aesthetic demands of the rising merchant class. These Dutch merchants linked northern and southern Europe. Through the East and West India Companies, Holland maintained commercial ties with most of the world's major markets. By the mid-1600s, Amsterdam had become the banking capital of the world. This new wealth spurred an unprecedented boom in art sales. Artists such as Jan Steen, who painted irreverent scenes of the Dutch lower class, soon found great fame and fortune. The true innovators, however, Frans Hals, Jan Vermeer, and Rembrandt, often clashed with public fashion. Hals abandoned finely detailed portraiture for more vibrant, almost impressionistic brushwork. Vermeer painted with tiny pinpoints of color, anticipating pointillism by more than 2 centuries. Rembrandt displayed an unerring sense of drama, an intimate grasp of character, and his own unique chiaroscuro, his play of light and shadow. Together, they created a vision of a time, a place, and a people unlike anything the world had seen before or would ever see again.
Jan Steen seems to be one of the most diligent and accurate observers. If he had been blessed with Michelangelo and Raphael for his masters, he now would have ranged with the great pillars and supporters of our art.
Writes English portrait painter Sir Joshua Reynolds in the late 18th century. William Blake, however, disagrees. Jan Steen was a boor, and neither Raphael nor Michelangelo could have made him any better. Jan Steen, 1626 to 1679, was the foremost humorist and storyteller of his day. Like his contemporary, French playwright Molière, Steen had an eye for drawing comic anecdotes out of everyday life. His paintings overflow with colorful characters and mischievous activity. Yet, these paintings are far from frivolous. An underlying morality keeps each scene from falling into bawdiness and slapstick. Jan Steen drew inspiration from the Dutch lower class. Growing up in Leiden as the son of a brewer, he became a shrewd observer of their habits and behavior. Taverns and public houses made common backdrops for boisterous scenes of drunken revelry, amorous intent, and petty thieving. Still, his paintings bear distinct traces of sympathy and affection for the people he so roundly lampoons. Steen lived among them his entire life, running both a brewery and an inn when finances allowed. Well-schooled in the classics and biblical texts, Jan Steen often recast ancient stories to suit contemporary taste. Even Rembrandt's classical Supper at Emmaus was not spared Jan Steen's revisionist brush. Proverbs and poems offer clues to the reading of his paintings. Words of caution and wisdom mixed with mild chastisement. Always the message is as direct as the visual narratives. Steen worked through the visual language of his day, emblem books in which engravings were supported by brief sayings and more elaborate homilies. He used these books as readily as he referenced the classics, forever combining the old with the new. As art historian F. Schmidt-Dechner wrote,
"Here was a man of learned Leiden who administered the death blow to pedantry."
Jan Steen moved often before returning to Leiden upon the death of his father in 1670. In between, he lived in The Hague, Warmond, and Haarlem, with time spent in Delft and Utrecht as well. Each city had its reigning school of art and its own revered painters. Jan Steen met many of these artists and studied with several. He almost certainly studied lower-class subjects with Van Ostade, and landscapes with Van Goyen, his future father-in-law. Precise influences are difficult to confirm. Jan Steen's 40-year career shows unusual consistency in content, color, and composition. He avoided Amsterdam, leaving him as one of the few later masters to stay out of Rembrandt's imposing shadow. He ignored seascapes, a subject which attracted almost every other Dutch painter of his time. Instead, his wanderings brought out the universal in his art. The lower class was his subject, every man his audience. Jan Steen's art succeeds through powerful gestures and honest, direct expression. Though capable of piety and sympathy, he preferred a festive and frolicking atmosphere. He poked fun at husbands and wives, the young and the old. He often included himself lurking among the protagonists. Self-portraits depict him as the willing buffoon, the smirking voyeur, or the profligate spender. Irrepressible mockery and sarcasm play across his features. The death of his first wife, Margaretha, in 1669, had a sobering impact. In Merry Company, he and Margaretha are joined by older and younger generations in a family portrait from happier times. The accompanying poem sheds light on the artist's enthusiasm and the simple philosophy that sustained him.
As we sing, you'll have to chirrup. It's a law the whole world knows. I lead, all follow suit, from baby to centenarian.
Jan Steen blurred the traditional distinction between high and low, between history and genre painting. For all their differences, it is no coincidence that Steen and Rembrandt were both students of humanism at the university in Leiden. Where Rembrandt worked to make the classics more intimate, Steen sought to elevate the everyday. Under his leadership, genre largely replaced history painting as a moralizing force in Dutch art.
What only Rembrandt has among the painters,
wrote Vincent van Gogh,
is that tenderness in the gaze, that heartbroken tenderness, that glimpse of a superhuman infinite that there seems so natural.
Rembrandt van Rijn was born in the city of Leiden in the summer of 1606. His mother was a baker's daughter. His father, Harmen, owned a mill on the Rhine River. No doubt Harmen held similar aspirations for his young son. As Leiden historian Jan Oorlers recalls, however,
Rembrandt had no interest in such a thing, and cared only for his natural talent for painting and drawing.
So, with his father's blessing, he moved to the city of Amsterdam to study with one of Holland's leading artists, Peter Lastman. At a time when most Dutch painters concentrated on still life, genre, or landscapes, Lastman instilled in the young Rembrandt a love for history painting, especially the biblical scenes of Bellini and Titian. This fascination with religious subjects had deep roots in Rembrandt's youth. His mother was a devout Protestant, but religion in the Van Rijn household was less dogmatic than humanistic. Through his art, Rembrandt united the passions of man with the benevolence of a loving, caring God. Jan Oorlers, writing in 1641, remembers,
After he stayed with Lastman for 6 months, Rembrandt decided to set out as an artist himself, and was rewarded with such success that he is today one of the most famous painters of our century.
Rembrandt returned to Leiden in 1625 and set up a joint studio with another promising artist, Jan Lievens. They soon caught the eye of prominent Dutch intellectual and author Constantijn Huygens.
I have intentionally saved for last a word about two young and noble painters from Leiden. At first glance, I would say that Rembrandt is superior for his confident stroke and dramatic realism.
During his early years, Rembrandt mastered the difficult technique of etching, and in the process, catalogued a wide range of subjects: family, religious scenes, landscapes, and wildlife. Rembrandt's reputation soon spread throughout Holland, particularly in the trading mecca of Amsterdam. Having received a number of commissions from that city, Rembrandt decided to move back to Amsterdam in 1631. It was here that his first group portrait was commissioned, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulip. In this and several works that followed, Rembrandt adds dramatic tension with his use of sharp lighting, color effects, and multiple brushstrokes. Still, many of his critics were not amused. Abraham Bruegel argues,
One must consider that great painters are not usually willing to lower themselves for a trifling draped half-figure in which the light shows only the tip of the nose, and in which one does not know where the light comes from, since all the rest is dark. The great painters try to show a beautiful nude body, in which one can see their knowledge of drawing. This is no business of great men, to occupy themselves with such trifles which almost anyone can do.
But Rembrandt held little interest in the beautiful nude body. He was fascinated with the inner radiance of his sitters, and rendered this elusive quality on both canvas and paper. In Amsterdam, Rembrandt met and married Saskia Eilenberg, an orphaned daughter from a wealthy family. In 1634, he and Saskia settled into a large house on the Joden Breestraat in the affluent Jewish quarter. It was the beginning of what seemed to be the happy life of a successful painter. But the following years were not kind to the new couple. By 1640, Saskia had given birth to 3 children, none of whom survived their infancy. Rembrandt's private life began to unravel. First, his mother passed away. Then, after the birth of their 4th child, Titus, Saskia never recovered. She grew weaker and weaker, finally succumbing to death late in 1642. Rembrandt retreated into semi-retirement, caring for his infant son while quietly continuing to work. Despite its many tragedies, 1642 held a few bright moments. In that same year, Rembrandt received a commission to portray the company of officers under Captain Franz Banning-Koch. It was to be a vast painting, his most ambitious to date. Rather than distributing the figures equally across the canvas, as those before him had done, Rembrandt cast the scene in front of a triumphal arch, a huge stage set with some actors in the spotlight and others barely visible in the shadows. With this work, The Night Watch, Rembrandt reached his artistic maturity. He applies his pigments with confidence, sometimes liberally, in impastos. Unblended, the colors fuse not on the canvas, but in the eye. Images seem to move in and out of focus as one approaches the painting. Around this same time, a new woman entered his life. Her name was Hendrikje Stoffels. Rembrandt hired her to look after Titus and the household, but before long, she too began appearing on his canvases. They became lifelong companions. In the delicacy of his brushwork and the warm golden glow, one can still feel his affection for her. Still, his troubles mounted. Rembrandt had invested in a number of business enterprises that failed, bringing him to the brink of bankruptcy in 1656. His house on the Joden Breestraat and most of his possessions were auctioned to the public. His financial problems held further repercussions. Saskia's will required that Rembrandt never remarry. To wed Hendrikje meant forfeiting his inheritance. Rembrandt's refusal to marry his live-in lover created a public scandal. The ecclesiastical judges debarred her from receiving Holy Communion, and Rembrandt began losing commissions. And still, fate was not finished with them. Hendrikje Stoffels took ill in the summer of 1661 and died the following year. Rembrandt was selling paintings at pitifully low prices and was forced to sell Saskia's tomb in order to pay for Hendrikje's burial. 6 years later, he buried his 26-year-old son, Titus. The later years of Rembrandt's life were among the most prolific of his artistic career. Alone in his studio, he colored his canvas with the pain and passion of a turbulent, troubled, and fiercely independent life. His commissions increased again, some coming from as far away as the Sicilian nobleman Don Antonio Ruffo. At home, Rembrandt completed his finest group portrait, the Syndics of the Clothmakers' Guild. The guild elders look up from their work to catch an unseen intruder. Rembrandt endows these men with an even greater psychological weight than the Night Watch. The aging artist is as poised as his sitters. There remains the ever-present chiaroscuro, the dramatic light effects, and the use of smoky, almost monochromatic hues. But there is no more posturing, no need to compromise. As always, there were critics. Filippo Baldinucci, a contemporary of Rembrandt's, considered him
a painter, in truth, of much greater prestige than real greatness. He was a most temperamental man and despised everyone. It seems he had exceptional luck rather than merit.
Critic John Hunt, writing in 1711, was likewise unimpressed.
Rembrandt is not to be compared in the painting of character with our extraordinarily gifted artist, Mr. Rippingdale.
But Rippingdale is largely forgotten, and Rembrandt remains. The attribution of Rembrandt works has been a touchy subject in recent years. In 1969, on the 300th anniversary of the master's death, the Netherlands government funded the Rembrandt Research Project. This task force of Dutch art experts questioned the authorship of more than 100 canvases previously attributed to the old master. Though such high-tech methods as X-rays and neutron beams were used to examine the works, some of their methods were less exact. Complaints ranged from rather formless highlights to unclear construction to weak internal cohesion. While many hailed the panel for its landmark scholarship, others considered it Holland's hit squad. Museums around the world were quick to deny that their Rembrandts were less than authentic, and the debate continues to this day. If nothing else, this re-examination has both confirmed and strengthened Rembrandt's reputation as the greatest of the Dutch masters. As Charles Baudelaire wrote in his Salon Review of 1846,
"That scoundrel Rembrandt is a sturdy idealist who makes us dream and guess at what lies beyond."
Very little is known of Frans Hal's life. Still, stories abound. He was originally thought by many historians to be a heavy drinker and violent husband. Later, those habits were discovered to belong to another Frans Hals, a weaver. Another legend has it that Hals was visited in Haarlem one afternoon by the great portraitist Antony van Dyck. Without revealing his true identity, Van Dyck modeled for Hals in order to observe the young artist whose growing reputation had by then reached London. The story goes that Van Dyck admired the likeness so much that he insisted Hals then sit for a portrait. When Van Dyck finished, Hals immediately recognized the artist's work, fell on his neck, and kissed him. Neither painting has been found. This much, however, is known. Frans Hals was born in the Flemish port of Antwerp in the early 1580s. When the Spanish army of King Philip II conquered the city in 1585, Hal's Protestant family fled north to Haarlem to avoid the return of the Catholic faith. Haarlem was a small but important city in Holland. It had long been an artistic center, hosting some of the greatest Dutch painters of the 16th century. These included such luminaries as Hendrik Goltzius and Hal's own teacher, Karel van Mander. It was here in Haarlem that Hals spent the last 80 years of his life, his long and prolific career spanning the golden age of Dutch art. As 17th century art critic Theodorus Schrevelius once wrote,
"Thanks to an extraordinary manner of painting which only he has mastered, Hals indeed surpasses his colleagues. His work bears the hallmarks of such power, such intensity of life, that the master seems to deceive nature with his brush. His portraits are painted in such a fashion that they seem to breathe and live."
In about 1610, he married Annika Harmens, who may have already been pregnant with their first child, Harmen. His wife died during the birth of their second child 4 years later. It pained him deeply that, as a young artist, he could give her no more than a pauper's grave. Despite his humble origins, Hals quickly developed influential connections with Haarlem's upper class of merchants and diplomats. In 1616, he joined the St. George militia, and in that same year secured his first large commission from the company. These civic guards commissioned group portraits each year to celebrate the appointment of new officers, and Hals quickly became their favorite portraitist. His use of strong diagonals and rhythmic colors helps relieve the stiffness of these paintings. Rather than building up his layers gradually to create solid forms, Hals lays his brushstrokes side by side for an almost impressionistic effect. As the years passed, Hals applied these elements liberally to his portraits of the upper class. One of his wealthy subjects, city historian Samuel Ampsing, is typical in his praise for the Dutch master.
"Forth, Hals, come forth! Take here a seat, yours it is by right. How dashingly Franz paints people from life."
Hals had a number of important students, including Adriaan van Ostade and Adriaan Brouwer. Though each developed their skills under Hals' attentive eye, his dashing style, his virtuosity of color and brush remain unique to the art of Frans Hals. As art historian, N.S. Trivers wrote in his 1941 study, The Paintings of Frans Hals,
When Hals' brush touches the canvas, it creates drawing and painting, volume and color simultaneously. Every brushstroke in his painting expresses at the same time relief, light, movement, material.
Despite a steady stream of commissions, Hals lived most of his life in debt. Eventually, he became a ward of the state, receiving a few hundred guilders a year from the city of Haarlem to sustain him in the twilight of his life. Hals died in 1667, well past the age of 80. But through his work, the 17th century town of Haarlem lives on. The Dutch city of Delft, some 30 miles below The Hague, was a thriving commercial center, and yet it retained the intimacy of older days, and a noble simplicity well suited to the city which held the tombs of the House of Orange, the Dutch dynasty of regents, and the remains of William the Silent, Prince of Orange. It was here that Jan Vermeer was born in 1632, the second child and only son to Reinier Jans Vermeer, an innkeeper and silk weaver of modest means. Reinier Vermeer also worked as an art dealer, which undoubtedly contributed to the younger Vermeer's decision to study painting. From the main rooms of his home attached to the inn, Vermeer could look across the square to De Nieuwe Kerk, the Protestant church that dominated the city skyline, or back onto a cobblestone alleyway that ran behind the house. Vermeer's sympathetic and attentively detailed views of Delft reveal a love for his hometown that sustained him through many difficult times. His early works betray the influence of Bramer, a prominent local painter, as well as the flourishing school of Utrecht. There, artists such as Abraham Bloemaert developed dramatically lit compositions based on the work of the early Italian Baroque painter Caravaggio. But soon Vermeer moves away from religious or historical subject matter in favor of genre subjects, images of domestic life. He turns to his beloved city of Delft and revels in the contrast of a peaceful canal, bright brick, and sweeping skies. In 1645, Vermeer turns inward and begins his series of domestic interiors. It is as if he opens a door for us, a door to a tranquil, comfortable world in which the unspoken passions, ambitions, and pleasures of his characters are revealed to us with startling realism. He often captured single women in the midst of their daily routine, or caught in private moments of joy or distress. These intimate depictions would consume Vermeer's energies for the remainder of his short life. Other interior or genre painters such as Gerard ter Borch, Pieter de Hoogh, and Jan Steen worked in Delft during the 1650s. It is likely that Vermeer knew most of them and was familiar with their paintings. But of the Delft circle, no artist received greater attention than a mysterious painter of whom little is known today. His name was Karel Fabritius, a pupil of Rembrandt and, at the time, Delft's most promising artist. Fabritius spent much of his short life developing his own style of genre painting, a clarity of light, color, and form that would influence Jan Vermeer, Pieter de Hoogh, and many lesser artists for years to come. Only 14 of his canvases have been identified. This study in objectivity, known as the Goldfinch, reveals his predilection for placing dark subjects against a light background, a strong statement of independence coming from Rembrandt's finest pupil. The same year he signed this canvas, Fabritius fell victim to the most tragic moment in Delft's history. On a cold October night in 1654, a fire broke out in the municipal arsenal. The artist may very well have been at the easel when the explosion ripped through the city. When the damage was finally assessed in the harsh light of day, over a quarter of the city had been destroyed. Hundreds had perished. Fabritius and most of his work were lost forever. With Fabritius' death, a circle of artists which had galvanized around him scattered to larger and more prosperous cities, but Jan Vermeer stayed, becoming almost overnight the city's new and promising talent. It was, wrote the Delft poet Arnold Bohn in 1654, as if Fabritius had gained new life in the hands of young Vermeer.
Thus did the phoenix to our loss expire, in the midst and at the height of his powers. But happily arose out of his fire Vermeer, who masterly trod his path.
In 1653, the same year he entered the Painters' Guild of St. Luke, Vermeer marries Catharina Bolness, but she is Catholic, and Vermeer, out of love for his bride, converts to Catholicism as well. The deeply Protestant citizens of Delft, patron city of the Dutch royal House of Orange, are dismayed. The long-awaited private commissions from wealthy citizens are slow in forthcoming. He has married for love, and soon Katharina is pregnant with the first of 11 children who will eventually scamper about their cramped 3-room dwelling in the home of his mother-in-law. In these domestic scenes of his mature style, Vermeer invites us into his home, or at least his home as he imagined it. The lead-lined windows, a silver gilt ewer, a harpsichord, a black and white tiled floor, paintings owned and traded by Vermeer, and a collection of globes and maps, proud testimony to Holland's seafaring tradition. There are more personal glimpses as well. The familiar sight of Katharina's pregnancy, her favorite silk jacket with fur lining, and perhaps even an early self-portrait. Vermeer's mature work anticipates the photographic image with its unerring perspective, multiple planes of focus, and bold foreshortening. He seems to have made extensive use of the camera obscura, casting images onto canvas for tracing and further study. It has been suggested that the circular dabs of light which frequently appear against his darker objects are in fact artifacts from the camera obscura process. His fellow artists recognize his talent, and in 1662, at age 30, he is elected as the youngest painter ever to head the Delft chapter of the Guild. But the badly needed commissions are sparse. Despite a modest inheritance and a number of quiet loans from friends, the Vermeer family struggles to get by. The situation worsens when war is declared with France in 1672. The stress of the war, his finances, and a large family is more than he can bear. 3 years later, Jan Vermeer dies. He leaves his widow and 11 children with substantial debts. In all, Vermeer painted fewer than 50 works, and much remains hidden and unexplained. There's hardly any sign of his many children, whom he must have loved dearly. How can a home so filled with the noise and commotion of young children dissolve into such peaceful canvases? Or is it an attempt to find peace and solace away from the burden of everyday life, an escape from difficult times? Whatever the answers, it is the art that remains, and with it, the memory of Jan Vermeer, the last great master of 17th century Holland. In scenes of everyday life, or genre painting, 17th century Dutch society comes alive. These works capture the full range of contemporary life: work and leisure, private homes and public buildings, the rich and the poor. Though related to portraiture, genre painting is more an extension of Dutch landscape and still life. Each reveals deeper meanings beneath the surface. Landscapes evoke a sense of national pride or the power of nature. Still lifes glorify God the Creator or caution against personal vanity. Genre scenes draw inspiration from the Bible or popular hymns. Devout Dutch audiences were familiar with such metaphors. With the rise of the Protestant faith in the early 17th century, the old language of religious symbols became increasingly outdated. Artists turned to a new literary source, the emblem books of Italy. Popularized by Italian humanists, these clever allegorical texts consisted of images, mottos, and addresses. Each scene was accompanied by a brief moral, with a longer passage detailing its meaning and implications. The intellectual and instructive feel of the emblem books appealed to the Northern Calvinists. Dutch painters incorporated images from these books into increasingly realistic compositions. Still, the first decades of the 17th century were transitional. Painters such as Willem Buitenweg and Esaias van de Velde distanced themselves from the stylized and highly refined qualities of 16th century Mannerist painting. While they successfully introduced new compositional elements, Buitenweg and others laid out their visual metaphors rather ponderously, achieving only a limited naturalism. It was not until the next generation that genre painting fully matured under the leadership of the Flemish-born painter Adriaan Brouwer. Brouwer was the master of the peasant piece and was famous for his scenes of criminals and other unsavory types. He influenced a generation of Haarlem painters notable for their unsophisticated compositions. With these unapologetic portrayals of the working class, the separation from Mannerist narratives is complete. Nevertheless, artists such as Adriaan van Ostade still managed to dignify their fallen subjects. The underlying morality of many Haarlem works remains somewhat enigmatic, as their literary sources are not always evident. These works are typically viewed as rueful glimpses into the lives of fallen Christians. Clearest reference to Italian and Dutch emblem books could be found in genre paintings from the university town of Leiden. Artists such as Gerrit Douw and Gabriel Metsu built up single compositions from a number of emblem book etchings. The moral lesson of the finished painting is derived from these images. Quite often, the hidden lesson contradicts the apparent narrative. Deciphering such themes as carnal sins or deceitfulness requires a knowledge of the emblematic language. For example, The Quack, a 1652 genre piece by Gerrit Douw, is rich in symbolic meaning. What first seems little more than an anecdote from everyday life unfolds as an elaborate metaphor for human deception. The so-called doctor relates the wonders of his latest elixir to the guileless crowd. The display of his questionable credentials conjures up the saying, "The seal gives confidence." While listening, one woman falls victim to thieving children. Another image from an emblemata print, the woman cleaning her child, reminds us that we never lose our humble beginnings. The emblemata text asks, "What is man but stench and filth?" Other symbols provide insight into the doctor's character. The boy chasing a bird represents greed, while the underdone pancake makes reference to his half-baked scheming. The comparison of dead and thriving trees, as in this contemporary emblemata, elevates the picture's moral ground to the struggle between good and evil. Such hidden meanings found favor with moralists of the day, including Jacob Katz.
Proverbs are particularly attractive because of a certain mysterious quality. For while they appear to be one thing, in fact they are another, so that when in time the reader grasps the exact meaning and intention, he experiences great pleasure of discovery, not unlike someone who, after a search, finds a beautiful bunch of grapes under thick leaves.
Douw was a pupil of Rembrandt. He adopted Rembrandt's chiaroscuro to create his own elegant lighting effects. Both Douw and Metsu painted in a highly finished style, with precise drawing and attention to detail. In order to satisfy public taste, allegories could not be pursued at the expense of realism. The Leiden artists were rewarded for their efforts with the nickname Feinschilders, or fine painters. A similar style was adopted by the painter from Deventer, Gerard ter Borch. Ter Borch established a reputation as the biographer of the upper class, both as a portraitist and as a genre painter. In choosing the upper class for his subjects, it was easy for him to explore the popular genre themes of vanity and luxury. His gift for rendering materials and other surfaces led him to create canvases which were more aesthetic than moralistic. In the southern city of Utrecht, an alternative form of genre painting developed. Unlike many of the great Dutch artists, Gerard van Honthorst and Hendrik ter Bruegen spent considerable time in Rome. They were history painters by trade, but took to genre for its greater immediacy and were strongly influenced by the narrative paintings of Caravaggio. The Utrecht artists preferred single figures or small groups. These figures often appear life-size, crisply outlined against a plain background. In the spirit of Gabriel Metsu and the Leiden school, the quiet beauty of these scenes belies their underlying sexuality and double entendre. This serenity remains far afield from the uproar of the Haarlem taverns and brothels. Outside of Utrecht, this style had its most pronounced effect in the work of the Delft painters Jan Vermeer and Pieter de Hoogh. Vermeer uses the same placid atmosphere in his depictions of domesticity and love. Where other artists sermonize, Vermeer contemplates. Pieter de Hoogh also explored the domestic interior. While de Hoogh was probably the first recorder of such scenes, he learned a great deal from Vermeer. The balanced composition, effusive light, and pronounced perspective are all characteristic of Vermeer's style. But the greatest genre painter, Jan Steen, was not associated with any one school. He traveled throughout most of his career, picking up the influences of several artists. As a young man, he lived in Leiden, applying the city's dense symbolism to his own domestic interiors. Later, he focused on the lower class under the tutelage of Adrian van Ostade. However, it is as a comic painter of wild, crowded brothels, fairs, and festivals that he is best remembered. While his views are often complex and frantic, the details remain sharp and readable. His paintings succeed both in their visual splendor and their subtler allegories. Like most Dutch genre paintings, this reigning chaos is actually a call for moral order. Portraits chronicle the changing tastes of a nation. Beginning in the early 15th century, northern painters, led by Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden, established an objective portrait style. Meticulous and detailed, the success of these early paintings rested on the artist's observations of the physical world. For more than 100 years, Dutch painters continued in this manner. Art historian Vincenzo Carducci wrote in the early years of the 17th century,
"The great and eminent painters were not portraitists, because a portraitist has to submit to an exact likeness of his model, whether beautiful or ugly, without using his reason or his learning. And a man whose mind and eyes are accustomed to good proportions and forms cannot do so without harming his whole mental attitude."
By the middle of the 16th century, however, this neutrality was slowly replaced with a more intuitive style borrowed from the Renaissance. Personality traits were added to the rendering. This mixture of traditional detail and Italian rhetoric set the foundation for Dutch portraiture. Michiel van Miereveld was the most popular Dutch portraitist of the early 17th century. His formal portraits, with their three-quarter-length views, stiff poses, and subdued expressions, bear a strong resemblance to previous works. A long-awaited shake-up in the orthodox portrait style came with the arrival of Frans Hals. Working in Haarlem, Hals enlivened his subjects with bold brushstrokes, warm tones, and more penetrating psychological profiles. Some seem to be musing over a private joke. Others confront the viewer with a confident and patronizing air. Yet even Hals remained trapped within an old and regimented genre. The upright format, unadorned background, and three-quarter-length pose are familiar. His sitters might twist, turn, and smirk, but they could not break totally free from the established ground rules of portraiture. By the final decades of the 17th century, economic prosperity had cultivated a national taste for luxury. The relatively drab appearance of most portraits soon gave way to opulence. Artists like Caspar Netzer and Gerard ter Borch captured the spirit of successful city burghers and the upper class through richly embellished portraits. In 17th century Holland, black and somber clothing were replaced with more luxurious and colorful silks and velvets. Hairstyles and accessories changed as well. For painters who wished to make a living at their art, portraiture was often the last refuge of the penniless. Their livelihoods were frequently dictated by the whims of popular vanity. As 17th century English poet and critic John Dryden once wrote,
"Good heaven, that sots and knaves should be so vain, to wish their vile resemblance may remain, and stand recorded at their own request, to future days a libel or a jest."
While artists strove to turn such commerce into art, taking too many artistic liberties with a subject might jeopardize the commission. Notary public Adriaan Locke, in 1654, recorded a dispute between Diego Andrada and Rembrandt.
The accuser finds that the aforementioned portrait does not at all resemble the face of the young maiden, and the accuser lets the accused know by notary that he must alter the portrait before the departure of the aforementioned maiden and to make it into a true likeness.
The most lucrative commissions, however, were the group portraits ordered by the guilds and the large canvases commemorating officers of the civic guards in Haarlem and Amsterdam. The Dutch were the first to commission a large number of such portraits. In the early years, the stiff, awkward appearance of single portraiture was merely heightened by the difficulties of combining a large number of individuals in one scene. Eventually, masters like Rembrandt and Hals found greater possibilities in large scenes. Each sitter played an important role in the final composition. Though not all patrons cared to sacrifice likeness for spatial harmony, most withheld criticism in light of the finished work. Civic Guard portraits like Rembrandt's Night Watch and Hals' St. George Militia are masterpieces of 17th century portraiture. Perhaps the most unusual subject for group portraits was the anatomy lesson. Leaders of the local surgeons' guilds in Haarlem, Amsterdam, and Utrecht conducted public autopsies at least once a year. The events were popular among curiosity seekers and the strong of stomach. Each local governor or prelector commissioned 1 or 2 portraits to memorialize his service to the guild. Of course, portraits were commissioned only by those rich enough to afford them: the professional classes, the guilds, and the militias. While working-class citizens were subjects for the occasional canvas, artists generally preferred genre or landscape scenes when painting for the open market. Rembrandt, of course, returned to history painting as often as time and finances allowed. As Sir Joshua Reynolds, the 18th century English portrait painter, once wrote,
"A history painter paints man in general. A portrait painter, a particular man, and consequently a defective model."
Still, these 17th century portraits serve as an impressive family album of the Dutch people and their time. Though the technical achievements of the still life painters were unmatched by other artists, it was historically considered the lowest form of painting, as Samuel van Hoogstraten reflected in 1678.
Still life is the ordinary soldier in the army of art.
Artists, of course, found several advantages in still life painting. It could be done indoors at little cost. It relied more on careful observation than imagination, serving as both training ground and showcase for artistic technique. And the subjects never complained. A great deal of care went into these works. Light and textural effects were achieved through exacting brushwork. The deceit was enhanced through the use of a copper plate, wood panel or canvas backing, or impastos and glazes, depending upon the desired effect. Perhaps the still life artist, with his tricks of the trade, too closely resembled the everyday Dutch craftsman. If painting was to gain respect as a liberal arts discipline, it would be through the imagination and innovation found in history painting, rather than the mimicry of still life. But there was good reason and a ready market for visions of overflowing wealth. Dutch trade had led to great domestic prosperity. It is expressed in the showpieces of painters like Willem Kalf, Peter Klaas, and Willem Klaas Hede. These richly colored, sumptuous tables floated in shadow and veiled light, full of imported porcelains and fabrics, rare shells, and exotic foods. The almost classical compositions are executed with a great eye for detail, a love of precision that coincided with many discoveries in the fields of biology and botany, as well as the arrival of exotic plants from foreign ports of call. The public passion for raising exotic flowers reached epidemic proportions with the tulip craze of the early 17th century. Tulips had recently been imported from the Near East, and their unique shape and assortment of colors attracted many willing buyers. An artificial market arose as prices for tulip bulbs skyrocketed. At the heart of this hysteria was the search for the perfect black tulip, an elusive hybrid species that inspired much horticulture and more than a little graft. The Dutch tulip trade finally collapsed in 1637. Most striking about Dutch still lifes is their incredible virtuosity. Floral centerpieces appear almost fragrant, while a bowl of fruit stands ready to serve. Post-Impressionist painter Henri Matisse explained the art of still life as follows.
A glass of water with a flower is a different thing from one with a lemon. The object is an actor. It only says what one makes it say.
Gradually, still lifes began to acquire other meaning, expressed in the Latin motto, ars longa, vita brevis. Art outlasts life. The cardinal and art lover Federico Borromeo wrote,
Then, when winter encumbers and restricts everything with ice, I have enjoyed from sight and even imagined odor, if not real, flowers expressed in painting, and in them a variety of colors, not fleeting as those found in nature, but stable and very endurable.
Man's life, too, is temporary. All craving for glory, wealth, love, is ultimately a vain attempt to overcome the finality of death. Life's material quest is vanity, or vanitas. It is symbolized by overripe fruit, snuffed-out candles, timepieces, and human skulls. Vanitas paintings, or memento mori, were reminders of man's fragile hold on this world. In them, the still life painter found equal academic status, as intellectually and emotionally satisfying as the depiction of religious or historical subject matter. The painter, Jan Bruegel.
Look upon this flower, which appears so fair and fades so swiftly in the strong light of the sun. Mark God's word. Only it will flourish eternally. For the rest, the world is naught.
Not all subjects were immensely popular with the 17th century Dutch public. Mythological and religious pictures, collectively known as history painting, lost out to less ideal and more pragmatic concerns. As artists began concentrating on the realistic depiction of local subjects, myths and miracles became increasingly passé. History painting had long been the product of Catholic art centers in France and Italy, and helped disseminate biblical teachings to a largely illiterate public. But the Protestant Netherlands sought a different religious expression, replacing traditional faith with more tangible and practical beliefs. History paintings were mostly commissioned by wealthy patrons with an interest in humanist studies. The opening years of the 17th century marked the decline of traditional history painters like Cornelis Cornelis and Abraham Bloemaert. Though these artists continued to paint large-scale dramas well into the middle of the century, their audience had already abandoned them in favor of the equally difficult and more interesting genre scenes. A small breed of new history painters, led by Peter Lastman, soon took their place. Lastman and others sought greater historical accuracy. They strictly adhered to governing texts and chose only those incidents which could be clearly understood through visual narration. Such literal interpretations appealed to the Dutch people and their earthbound philosophy. As a further concession to popular taste, Lastman and other artists closed the gap between myth and reality by rendering their subjects with greater naturalism and candor. As Vincent van Gogh once wrote in a letter to Émile Bernard,
The Dutch had no imagination, but they had extraordinary taste, and an infallible feeling for composition.
To reduce the artificiality inherited from the Mannerist painters, they adopted techniques from the Italian master Caravaggio. The two leading Caravaggists were Gerard van Honthorst and Heinrich ter Brucken. Honthorst was greatly influenced by Caravaggio's strong dramatic lighting. He became a specialist in lighting techniques of his own, using prominently placed candles and lamps. Another favorite conceit was a mysterious unseen luminescence cast over a nocturnal scene. Honthorst demonstrated exceptional skill in describing such effects, applying them just as easily to scenes of everyday life. Ter Brucken painted in a higher key, a lighter palette than either Caravaggio or his countryman Honthorst. While most of the Utrecht history painters reduced compositions to a few essential elements, Ter Brucken was the most successful at maintaining a coherent narrative in the style of Lastmann. Like Honthorst, Ter Brucken was equally comfortable with genre painting. But the greatest history painter of the Dutch 17th century was Rembrandt van Rijn. As a student in Lastmann's studio, Rembrandt became fascinated with history painting at an early age. Although adept at all manner of painting, he considered himself a history painter. He returned to religious and mythological subjects as often as his commissions would allow. From Lastmann, and from his studies at the University of Leiden, Rembrandt cultivated a great respect for historical texts. At first, he worked comfortably within the Baroque tradition, creating deep spaces articulated by dispersed light and impenetrable darkness. Later, he adopted his chiaroscuro lighting technique with clearer illumination. Spaces became shallower and emotional distance diminished. Rembrandt did his best to preserve the rich tradition of history painting. As a teacher, he encouraged many younger artists to follow his lead. Painters such as Govard Flink, Gerard de la Ressa, and Art de Helder freely borrowed his compositions and themes, though they lacked the master's unifying vision. A more superficial, elegant style emerged in the late 17th century, encouraged by the French Royal Academy. The most highly regarded Dutch history painter of the period was Adriaan van der Werf. His incidental airy scenes bear no resemblance to earlier works by Lastmann, Ter Brucken, or Rembrandt. After Rembrandt's death in 1669, local contributions to historical painting fell into decline. Still, the old master would have agreed with William Blake, who said,
"The man who never in his mind and thoughts traveled to heaven is no artist."
The harvest of our landscape painters is so great and famous in our Netherlands that anyone attempting to name them all would fill a small book,
writes Constantijn Huygens in 1629.
It can even be said, as far as naturalism is concerned, that in the works of these clever men nothing is lacking but the warmth of the sun and movement caused by the gentle breeze.
The Dutch did not invent landscape painting, but they made it all their own. There was pride in their land and their newfound freedom, their independence from Spain. But this pride extended beyond political independence. The land was also the source of newfound commercial power, with its network of rivers and roads and its strategic location on the corner of Europe. And then there was the never-ending battle with the sea. Erosion and flooding proved daily threats to the vulnerable lowlands. Dikes and canals were constructed in defiance of the sea. Land reclaimed from it was precious. The variety of landscape styles defies the physical reality of the flat and often monotonous Dutch countryside, unhindered by mountains, infinite. The Dutch clouds a dramatic contrast to the serenity of the land. Artists would take to these open countrysides with sketchbooks and chalk, returning to the studio to satisfy their imaginations through aerial perspectives and liberal reinterpretation of what they had seen and observed. Among the first 17th century landscape specialists was Esaias van de Velde. He and the early realists created landscapes and seascapes that were readily accessible and spatially unified. Jan van Goyen was a student of van de Velde. His early paintings of colorful wintry scenes and country roads show the influence of his teacher. But by 1630, van Goyen had developed a more harmonious style of painting. In scenes such as this river landscape with windmill and ruins, he combined van de Velde's unified space with a reduced range of color values and hues to create the warm, tonal landscape. Van Goyen's style was soon shared by other painters, most notably Solomon van Ruysdael. But gradually, Ruysdael introduced stronger light effects, an element of drama and contrast lacking in van Goyen. In this, Ruysdael came close to the work of Albert Cuyp, whose light palette had matured in Venice. Cuyp applied his colorful palette to pastoral views, inspired as much by Dutch elements as his memories of the Italian landscape, basking in the gold of an afternoon sun. Still, the greatest and most versatile of the Dutch landscape painters was Solomon van Ruysdael's nephew, Jacob van Ruysdael. Before he turned 20, Jacob had already demonstrated a flair for natural detail and striking monumental effect. Aging castles and mills were heroic in a manner never quite seen before. Scenery took on symbolic significance in works such as this Jewish cemetery. Here, the fleeting quality of life is represented by the ruins of Egmont Abbey. Withered trees, changing weather, and the tombstones of Oudekerk on the Amstel River. Ruysdael, in turn, taught Meindert Hobbema, who specialized in wooded landscapes. His tree-filled views continued to employ the naturalism and painstaking observation found in Ruysdael's work. But where Ruysdael was monumental and powerful, Hobbema was personal and serene, maintaining a sense of intimacy, a peace with God and country. It is one of the keys to understanding the art of 17th century Holland. The glass of lemonade is a study in seduction. A male visitor suggestively stirs a young woman's glass under the watchful eye of her attendant, typically the matchmaker. It remains unclear whether she will accept his silent proposal. Ter Borch was concerned more with aesthetics than symbolic narrative. Here we see him mastering the play of light and shadow on a variety of surfaces, faces, hands, and rumpled clothing. This work, now in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, once belonged to the Empress Josephine Bonaparte. As a painter for the upper class, Ter Borch would have been pleased. Holland. This small nation and its determined people rose above foreign domination and internal strife to become, in its day, one of the great economic powers of Europe. In their search for national identity, Dutch painters redefined their art, while history painting remained largely the province of the Italian masters. Genre scenes, landscapes, still lifes, and portraiture would never be the same again. Vincent van Gogh, studying Rembrandt's Jewish Bride in 1885, turned to a friend and remarked, "I should be happy to give 10 years of my life if I could go on sitting here in front of this painting for a fortnight with only a crust of dry bread for food." 300 years after Rembrandt's death, artists still turn to this master, this scoundrel Rembrandt, and his contemporaries for technique, subject matter, and human insight. Jan Steen, Frans Hals, Jan Vermeer, and Rembrandt. If all art is an attempt to outlast life, to transcend our brief existence, then these artists are with us still. In this quiet courtyard, this tranquil sea, these windmills turning softly in the cool northern breeze, one can still feel the presence of the Dutch masters of the 17th century.